Welcome to this edition of the Tidal Cyber Fireside Chat Series. We've got this covered. We have with us our latest entrance into the product registry. We have both Nigel as well as Thomas coming to us from the Falco project and SysDig. Welcome to you both. And Nigel, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll get Thomas to do the same.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Nigel. I work at SysDig. I work on the technical marketing organization, and I focus on primarily aligning Falco with our enterprise technology SysDig Secure, and making sure that users can see value, like we see here with the MITRE alignment. I'll leave Thomas to introduce himself.
Hi everybody. So I'm Thomas. I'm working for SysDig either. I'm ecosystem and open source advocate, and basically my job is to improve the user experience of end users, developers, and partners about Falco. I come from the community, so I developed some tools, and I use Falco for 6 years now, and after 5 years doing that, doing talks by my own, SysDig asked me to join them to do it as my day job and not on my free time.
That's the best way to do it. We had our director of CTI, Scott Small, and he had a similar route of he had the control validation compass as a GitHub project, and he liked what we were doing at Tidal. It's like, well, why don't we do that full time? So a very, very similar story to tell there. So that's great. So since it was mentioned as both SysDig and Falco, I think the most logical place to start is what's kind of the easy way of understanding the relationship between those two?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to summarize it is, for quite some time now, there's been this open source project, Falco. It's something of a standard when it comes to host and container security. Think of it like an IDS, like Snort, but an advanced solution in that. Again, for new technologies like Kubernetes in the cloud, it works perfectly well in the sense that it's got an extensible plugin architecture. So by default, we have system calls. So anything logically on a host or even within a container, we can see what's happening. So things like file integrity, if there's any changes on file permissions, if there's network activity, we can see, for instance, if something was deleted or if something was spawned. So, it's quite flexible in the sense of we can see what's going on in the hosting containers. And then when we talk about the plugin architecture, well, basically we can just stream events from other audit sources, other log sources from other supply chain tools, even the cloud, and stream that through Falco, so that Falco has this essentially a single YAML-based, rule-based language. And then we can use that same language for detecting threats in cloud, containers, GitHub, identity providers like Okta. There's a whole range of different areas of security that we can be a part of. Fundamentally, Falco is open source. So where SysDig comes into it is we just really have an enterprise solution that extends on all those capabilities we see in Falco. So things like being able to respond to threats that we otherwise detect in Falco, or giving users an enterprise dashboard so that they can better understand how rules tie into regulatory framework standards. I guess from your perspective, Thomas, if there's anything else you wanted to add on that from what Falco does as a solution?
No, basically, we see Falco as a security camera over your system. It's able to detect strange behaviors that may happen. Basically, the philosophy is we know CVEs are detected every day, basically. And even if you scan your image, even if you are trying to build a fortress, bad things may happen. And so whatever the way the attackers got access to your system, what breach they use, at the end, they always trying to do the same things: data extractions, crypto mining, ransomware. They are trying to do privilege escalations, all these patterns. So by collecting the syscalls, we are at the lowest possible level. So we see everything with Falco. And with a set of rules, we are applying these rules to these events, and we are able to trigger alerts.
Yeah, so I mean that ties in very nicely with a lot of the original foundations for why attack came into existence, right? It was trying to recognize that, yeah, you can do CVEs and try to keep them out all day, but sooner or later bad things are going to happen. And how do you utilize the data that you have more effectively? So I think it's a very logical story for how attack might come into play for you guys. But how did attack come into play for the Falco rule set? I mean, obviously you have a lot of different data that you can leverage, a lot of non-traditional data, especially. So how did attack come into play, and where does that kind of sit within in the realm here?
Yeah, I think Thomas, you've got an interesting story there from one of the core contributors.
Yeah, so basically, the relationship between Falco and the MITRE ATT&CK came from someone in the community, not from the core developers, not from the plugin developers or else. Basically, a security engineer came 1 year and 1.5 years ago, and with big PR, adding labels to the rules, the Falco rules, to map the tactics and sub-tactics ID with the rules. And 1 year after, she became an official core maintainer of Falco. So she started to add these elements for her own usage or her company usages. I don't know exactly. And then she stayed and she's involved more deeply in the development of Falco. In the last months, we have, as core developers, core maintainers of Falco, we have been contacted by several companies like Tidal, like others, to improve the relationship between the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the rules. And another company came 2 months ago, 1 month ago, with 21 new rules to map the gaps we may have between the rules and the framework.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. That's exactly where I was going to go. Is how does attack play a role today at both of the organizations, whether it be the open source project or whether it be SysDig proper? How does attack fit into that story?
Yeah, I think the biggest part is the credibility. You know, we see, especially from Falco's side, you know, community members needing to align a standard, a framework with rules to ensure where's the gap in coverage. So for instance, if we were not building rules to detect specific network related activity, what I mean by network is when we look at MITRE ATT&CK, things like data exfiltration, then there is clear coverage gap. And that same logic, that same desire exists within SysDig Secure, is that we want to show across all the tactics and the techniques and sub-techniques, how good is our coverage? Because that shows how complete an IDS or even an endpoint detection solution it is. But also, when it comes to Falco, since it is a open source rule system that anyone can contribute rules to, or as an end user, you can modify, you know, create your own, you know, there's no reason why we can't provide greater coverage within MITRE ATT&CK. Since it's considered something of a standard amongst the security community, it's the best possible way of showing that credibility.
So how do you handle the concept of coverage, right? So it's great to aspire for coverage. Are you trying to look across every tactic, specific tactics? Is there any kind of unique focus that you guys have? Like what do you try to achieve when you mean coverage?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Actually, Thomas, there was a part of the community, wasn't there, a team dedicated recently to actually finding gaps within the MITRE framework and actually pointing out where are the opportunities for these community members to build curated rules actually to solve that gap in coverage. And again, Tidal is a great place to start that.
Falco is a community project. A lot of rules have been created by anyone, basically, by some folks in the community. So one step by step, as we are adding new rules, we are covering automatically more and more tactics, because when someone has a specific need and for a specific pattern, it's often related to a gap in the matrix. So month after month, we are covering more and more the matrix framework. And as Nigel said at the beginning, we also have a plugin framework in Falco. So some techniques can be related directly to the syscalls collections. But with these plugins, we are able to collect any kind of events you may have in your ecosystems. We are covering more and more dead angles.
Very cool, very cool. And I think one of the interesting things also about your capabilities that you have is that they're also looking at systems that are oftentimes like the later ones to arrive, right? So my recollection is it's Linux, it's cloud, it's those type of platforms that you support. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So like so far, if you go to the official MITRE framework webpage, you'll notice that there's frameworks for, again, it's not a specific cloud provider, it will be generically cloud. In the same way, there's a generic matrix for containers, and then the other one that we generally call enterprise, which applies to host-based systems. Now, there's some that we don't align with, so things like mobile apps, for instance. I think that's somewhere that we have less desire to be involved with. But certainly, it's not without belief that there'll be new matrix added as time moves on. Things like Kubernetes is something we're heavily focused on within the Falco and SysDig projects. So things like Kubernetes has its own audit logging service. We have a lot of curated rules already for Kubernetes. Now, of course, there's no standard framework for Kubernetes at this time. You see people, software vendors saying, here's how I would create what we call MITRE ATT&CK framework. So they're piggybacking off it. Exactly. And then to show how good their coverage is. But of course, it's arbitrary because anyone could come up with a similar table. But I think we are showing that we're somewhat future-proof in the sense of having different plugins, like we talk about identity, supply chain, Kubernetes. So for DevOps engineers, as new frameworks evolve and become clear within MITRE ATT&CK, then there's no reason why we can't tag our rules, rebuild rules to align better with these newly designed frameworks, and ultimately show security teams that as frameworks evolve, as these become the ways of, let's say, standard approaches for showing what your security posture is, that we have detection system that's immediately ready for those solutions. So I think that's kind of our unique approach to it.
That's a really, really interesting aspect to how you approach the problem, but it kind of highlights another challenge in the fact that lots of platforms, lots of different data sources means lots of rules. Now, I think that obviously maybe part of the strategy there is to crowdsource, but I'm interested in how do you guys approach detection when there's so many different opportunities and so many different ways of detecting? Like, I imagine that you guys have a really interesting vantage point at the problem, and obviously with the success that you guys are having, some idea of how to solve it. So how do you guys approach it?
Yeah, I guess, Thomas, if you want to start on the Falco approach.
Basically, as Falco is relying at the kernel level, whatever your cloud whatever the cloud provider you are using, whatever the versions of Kubernetes you are running, at the end, it's basically a Linux system with a kernel. So by collecting the syscall, it's the most generic way to detect things, because from one system to another, the syscall is mostly always the same. So, by leveraging this event, we are able to have a generic rules. Of course, you may have to tune them a little to add in whitelist some specific pod or images or Docker images, but for the audit logs, for example, whatever the solutions you are using, the audit logs is always from Kubernetes, from the control plane, is always the same. Whatever the cloud providers or managed clusters you have. So with the rules, you can replicate the same behavior from one cluster to another.
So I'm interested in how you guys tackle the threat portion of your problem. So what I mean by that is I recall from my time at MITRE, right? Like there's always this demand for more Linux attack and more Mac attack and things like that. But oftentimes there's a lack of threat intel, which prevented it to kind of get into the system. And I know that Kat's been putting in a lot of effort to try to continue to make the Mac attack and Linux attack blossom. But I'm just interested in how you guys are solving the problem, or how you guys deal with, I guess is maybe the better way of saying, how do you deal with the threat intel that can kind of be spotty in terms of how do you develop those detections?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, like Thomas said, when we're talking about open source Falco, any end user can modify it for their own unique business requirements. So whether that be whitelisting, creating exclusions to essentially say, don't detect these things because it's our production application, and yes, it's not part of our zero trust design. But how that differs, let's say, from SysDig, and it's just another implementation of Falco. But with SysDig, we have a dedicated threat research team. So what they're doing is, being involved in the security community, seeing things in the wild, understanding the anatomy of these attacks, like you mentioned, is perfect, because when we build these security rules, we build them around the feedback of threat intel. And whether that be creating rules that, yes, align with MITRE, but also need to have less false positive detections. So sometimes you will have a broader scope to make sure, okay, or sometimes it's oddly specific, and that's fine as well. It's just, you don't want to say anytime something gets deleted because it's data destruction and therefore it's MITRE, I need to trigger alerts on it. Otherwise, you're just going to have a flood of alerts. So it needs to be specific, critical applications where we see data destruction, stuff like that. But I think having a threat intel team is ideal for understanding what is going to happen in large numbers, and therefore it's not something to be focused on, versus what is a critical security incident and therefore should be considered with the utmost, focus.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on the variety of detections that can exist, and that there isn't one necessarily right or wrong. I think if you think about in the ideal world, right, we all do behavioral detection that is completely independent of procedures, and as much as it can be, definitely independent of IOCs. But at the end of the day, procedures happen, and you kind of need some of these more focused detections. And so I like that you brought up that, sometimes they're going to be more specific and sometimes they can be more general, but it's about trying to understand when one is working and when another one would work better. I really like that aspect, because I think that, to me, that's one of the things that's oftentimes lost when we talk coverage and attack. It's oftentimes focused on either breadth of attack techniques coverage, and we already discussed kind of how you guys are approaching that. But then there's also people that argue for depth of coverage. And it's not a universal yes or no, right? In some cases, maybe there is that one or two rules that are just broad enough and done smart enough that they're actually good, versus one that has a lot of them, but you need a lot because there's a lot of procedures. So, right, there's no silver bullet, I guess, is my point there. So I think there's really a lot of interesting in the detect problem around. So that's very, very helpful. And I also like that you brought up threat-informed defense without necessarily calling it that, but like understanding threat and understanding what is right for you, which leads me into kind of like the why Tidal, right? And so Tidal does have this public registry which you're submitting to, and again, greatly appreciate being able to showcase what you guys have in your open source project in the platform. But like, what value are you hoping that customers see in your product as it relates to Tidal?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious one is people like Thomas now, who are community advocates and trying to promote this solution. It just makes sense for Falco to be in more communities. Why Tidal specifically? I guess MITRE ATT&CK as a framework is something that most, I mean, outside of containers, Kubernetes, and cloud, I'm talking about traditional infrastructure networking, security teams know what MITRE ATT&CK is. So again, it's that credibility piece, but also like getting into communities. Falco is a community-backed solution. It should be, awareness should be driven through a bunch of different community-backed aspects. And we don't see this any different. In fact, even just this message we're passing over today about wanting to, or a need for new matrix in the future for MITRE ATT&CK, how we see that, the need for those frameworks, and again, how Falco will align with those new matrix in the future, is more reason why, again, something like Tidal is necessary, is to show what vendors, what tools, let's say, are able to cover those different new, or let's say undiscovered platforms. So as things evolve, we want to be able to say Falco is the one with, like you mentioned, not just the one with breadth, but depth of coverage across those different solutions, again, whether it be identity, CI/CD, Kubernetes, cloud. But if there's anything, Thomas, you wanted to add on that and why it makes sense.
Yeah, basically, runtime security is not so familiar for people. But people are not really familiar with runtime security. By having something like Tidal, it's especially because we have the Matrix framework in a graphical way, it's easier for people to understand what are the benefits they may have with Falco, and how we can cover different patterns with different tools. If they want to do supply chain security, they can use that, and if they will see they have gaps, and if they had Falco, they will see they will cover much more different techniques that may be used by attackers.
Yeah, that's very cool, and I do like that you guys touched on the extensions of attack, because it is definitely something that we saw a lot at MITRE with people coming in, and when I was there, about people coming in and being like, all right, well, we've got attack for X, and it's like, well, there's some limitations, and it's not attack, but it's inspired by attack, but sure. So it's very interesting to think about the extensions, and it's one of the powers that we actually give our enterprise customers is to extend the attack matrix, whether it be tactics or techniques and so on and so forth, to really make attack their own in some ways. And so looking forward to seeing how the attack matrix evolves, as well as content creators like yourselves being able to extend it. So looking forward to seeing some of those things come down the line. The one thing that I wanted to touch on before we close out, though, is you mentioned a number of times, right? It is a community contribution based project. So how do people get involved? What's the right skill set? What can they do? How do they do it? But what's kind of the guidance that you can give there?
It's more on my part. So the core of Falco is written in C++. And so if you are confident in C++ and you know how kernel works, you can join the core team. But we are looking for much more different contributions. You can write rules, you can share your use case or your feedbacks about Falco. You can develop new integrations, plugins for inputs or integrations as outputs. Right now, Falco is able to forward its events to 50 to 53 outputs. But if you have a specific use case, you can help us with that. It's Go, it's not C++, so it's easier. We also have different tools in the ecosystems, like Falco CTL, Falco Cutter, to manage the lifecycle of rules. It's not mandatory to be involved directly in the core development, but we have so many different projects around Falco in its ecosystems. If you are motivated, you can help us for sure.
I believe it's at falco.org is the website, correct?
Exactly, official website. And as a CNCF project, we have a weekly community call every Wednesday at 4 p.m. UTC. It's the time to chat with the core maintainers, with end users. And we also have a Slack channel on the Kubernetes Slack. I think we are now more than 2,000 people. So 24/7, you will have someone to answer your questions and to help you with any troubles you may have. And you can just chat about what fun things you are doing with Falco. We are always open to listen to you about what you are doing with Falco. It's really valuable for us especially because in security, we may have the task of secrets to not say what we are doing to protect our environment. So it may be hard to have user experiences about how companies are using Falco. But if you are open to that, we recently in my team would be happy to listen to you and write with you the blog post to explain to the world how Falco protects your environment.
That's great. I think that right, coming from my history of so much great open source work, and so much transparency and just putting stuff out there for people to leverage, right? I think it hits on a lot of the common values that I have in terms of being able to make sure that we approach security as a community. And rules can be great and they can be sensitive, but at many times they can just be the way of defending against the bad guy, and figuring out ways of leveraging that rule more effectively and is oftentimes what becomes the more special sauce. But really appreciate the work that you guys are doing and the openness and transparency. And sounds like with 24/7 service from an open source project, I mean, what more can you ask for? So definitely appreciate the contribution. Well, thank you both for joining today. Again, really appreciate the Falco project being part of the platform and SysDig support through that. If anybody wants to reach out to submit to the registry, feel free to reach out to support@tidalcyber.com. Check out the community edition at app.tidalcyber.com. And I look forward to sharing more with you guys soon. Thank you very much, both Nigel and Thomas.